Okay, picture this. Imagine someone telling you well over 100 years ago that your brain is actively hiding thoughts from your conscious mind, that your earliest, fuzziest childhood experiences irreversibly shape who you are today, and that your internal emotional conflicts can literally dictate your physical health. At the time, most scientists absolutely laughed, and honestly, we probably would have too, right? It sounded a bit like magic. Well, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are dusting off a fascinating scientific cold case, and we're investigating the father of psychoanalysis himself, Sigmund Freud.
So I want you to act as the jury for us today. We're going to look at the hard biological evidence and ask one massive question. Did modern brain scanning tools completely destroy Freud's reputation once and for all, or did they accidentally validate his most radical ideas? See, for a long time, the scientific consensus was pretty brutal. Freud built psychoanalysis around 1900, relying on basically nothing but subjective conversations from a quiet, dim room with a couch. But science demands hard, measurable proof, and his total lack of technology became a huge problem for his legacy.
For decades, big critics, especially the philosopher Karl Popper, essentially laughed Freud straight out of the scientific community. Popper's main argument was that psychoanalysis was completely unfalsifiable. Because you couldn't test Freud's ideas in a controlled lab, you just couldn't classify his work as actual science. And for a while, it seemed like the case was totally closed. But here's the thing. How do you prove something you can't actually see? Well, you wait for technology to catch up. And eventually, the invention of the fMRI completely flipped the script on this historical verdict.
And this brings us to the major plot twist in our story. While a standard MRI just gives you a snapshot of brain anatomy, functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, is a real game changer. It allows neuroscientists to literally watch living brains think in real time. It highlights exactly which regions light up and become active during very specific mental tasks. So, for the very first time in human history, we didn't just have to guess based on how someone was acting. Researchers finally had a tool to peer directly inside the living skull and ask, can unconscious processes actually be measured?
All right, let's dive into the first huge piece of evidence, the unconscious mind. You know when you're driving home from work on a route you've taken 1,000 times, and suddenly you realize you don't remember the last 5 miles? Your brain was still processing enormous amounts of data to keep you from crashing, but doing all of it entirely outside your conscious awareness. Freud's biggest claim was that so much of human behavior originates in this hidden space. And guess what? MRI research now confirms exactly that. We can literally see something called the default mode network, which lights up like a Christmas tree during spontaneous thinking. Plus, modern subliminal studies show that implicit memories deeply influence our decisions, completely bypassing our conscious mind.
Actually, let's do something fun. I want you to actively participate in a famous experiment right now. This was first done by Benjamin Libet back in 1983. Hold up your hand for just a second. In a moment, I want you to make a choice to flex your finger. Ready? Go ahead, flex it. Now, here is the absolutely mind-bending part. If you are hooked up to an EEG machine during that simple movement, the machine would detect your brain preparing to move hundreds of milliseconds before you consciously reported making the decision. Your brain started the action before you even knew you were acting. Crazy, right?
The speed at which this science is evolving is truly staggering. We literally went from Freud's wild, unprovable guesses in 1900 to Libet catching preconscious activity in the 80s. But it gets even wilder. By 2008, a team of researchers led by Soon were using fMRI machines to predict free decisions up to 7 seconds before the subject even realized they had made a choice. Just think about that. 7 full seconds of unconscious neural processing leading the charge. It strongly supports Freud's core intuition about the absolute power of the unconscious mind. Now, think about a time you tried to completely block out a super embarrassing or painful memory. Freud called this mental trick a defense mechanism, basically saying the mind protects itself through tools like repression and denial. And while modern neuroscience doesn't back up Freud's exact, literal theories of repression, it absolutely confirms we have measurable biological networks that do this exact job. Modern MRI studies actually show the prefrontal cortex actively suppressing unwanted memories. It literally turns down activity in the hippocampus to successfully block a memory right out of your conscious mind.
And we now know these defense mechanisms are incredibly fragile, often forged super early in life. Freud caught a lot of flack for insisting that early childhood shapes the adult. But modern MRI? It definitively proves him right on the core concept. We can see that chronic early trauma physically alters three vital brain structures. Kids exposed to chronic abuse show devastating physical changes in the hippocampus, which handles memory, the amygdala for fear and emotion, and the prefrontal cortex, which regulates everything. And these altered biological stress responses, they don't just fade away. They physically persist for decades into adulthood.
Have you ever felt a sudden urge to just snap at someone in a fit of rage, but somehow managed to bite your tongue at the very last second? Freud imagined this as an epic, dramatic battle between our primitive, animalistic drives and our rational control. Now, obviously, he didn't have the anatomical terms, but neuroscience reveals a very real biological battle that perfectly mirrors this daily struggle. It's the rapid, impulsive, emotional responses of your limbic system, specifically your amygdala, constantly fighting to be regulated by your rational prefrontal cortex. It's different anatomy, sure, but a surprisingly similar concept to Freud's internal conflict.
But okay, let's pause right here, because we absolutely have to talk about that famous psychological iceberg concept you've probably seen a million times. It is vital to note what the scanner does not support. Modern neuroscience strictly rejects the id, the ego, and the superego as literal physical structures inside your head. You can't put someone in an fMRI machine and point to their ego. It just doesn't exist like that. Instead, modern science revises these ideas, replacing Freud's theoretical architecture with the concrete neural networks we've just been talking about, networks for unconscious processing, memory suppression, and impulse control.
And hey, since you're the jury today, we have to be completely fair to the evidence. Let's quickly clear the cutting room floor of what large-scale scientific evidence completely rejects. Because while Freud was definitely a pioneer, many of his highly specific theories were just entirely wrong. There is zero neuroscientific backing for the Oedipus complex, penis envy, his psychosexual developmental stages, or the idea that dream symbolism represents some universal truth. Modern large-scale evidence has firmly, permanently shut the door on those specific, culturally bound theories.
Yet, despite those spectacular misses, his surviving broader intuitions have kept this scientific cold case wide open. In fact, we're now seeing the rise of a really fascinating, somewhat controversial modern field called neuropsychoanalysis, championed by researchers like Mark Solms. This field actively combines the historical, deep insights of psychoanalysis with the hard, objective data of modern neuroscience. The whole goal is to build a much more complete picture of human motivation, emotion, and dreaming by literally using the couch and the scanner together.
Freud didn't have an MRI. He couldn't see neurons firing, and he certainly couldn't measure real-time brain activity. He was basically operating in the dark. But as we wrap up this explainer, having looked at the undeniable evidence of unconscious processing, biological defense mechanisms, and the lasting physical impact of childhood trauma, you really have to wonder, was he entirely wrong? Or was he simply a brilliant guy asking the exact right questions, just waiting 100 years for the technology to finally catch up? Definitely keep that in mind the next time you think you're in total control of your decisions. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.